he's the author of the book that you see, Nature's Calendar, which is described as an absorbing narrative, and I can verify that, that describes the intricate ecological connections and adaptations of the myriad organisms dwelling in a freshwater tidal wetland. And that's how Dr. Chris Swarth described the book. And I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Rees when I visited the Jug Bay Wetland Sanctuary, which I consider a sister to Dyke Marsh, but it's across the river in Maryland on the Patuxent River. And so Dr. Rees's book and his talk is based on many years of observations there, and he's going to talk about the changes in wetlands throughout the seasons. So thank you, everybody, for attending, and I will now yield the floor to Dr. Rees.
Thanks very much for that introduction. Again, may I add my apologies to, as you called it, the snafu last time, and to thank Deborah in particular for trying to overcome these obstacles. What you see is indeed the book, and more particularly Zorba, our Cavalier King Charles Spaniel. Alas, no later than this week died, I'm afraid, at 13 years of age. So you can imagine it's been a bit of a cloud this week to absorb his passing. If we could have the next slide, this shows you really the marsh that has been created because of the sinusoidal nature of the Patuxent River, which you see going from the top, going south to the Chesapeake Bay. And you can see it's a mix of woodland, the sanctuary being to the right, and the overlook, really, if you come along the most sinusoidal portion, where it makes a dramatic turn from the right to the left, that's an overlook point for the sanctuary to observe the marsh from at any time of the season. Take a look in particular, because I'll be referring to this, at that little green line that comes across the sort of lower third of the screen. That's the old railroad that, believe it or not, connected Washington to the Eastern Shore. And I'll be referring to that walk from time to time, because that allows you really to get very close to the marsh. Next slide. Now, this gives you a little bit more of an instruction of what I was talking about in terms of an aerial view. Take a look at the top of the screen and you can see the observation deck. I'll be really using that as a means to bring you into the north portions of the marsh as well as the Patuxent River. But if you come down along that shoreline, so to speak, and you can see that railroad track going right to the river pier. And there's an observation blind, which I want you to sort of zone in on a little bit, because that's another post, if you like, that I use for describing some of the events during the seasons. Come along that road again from the left to the right and continue until you reach Mark's Pond. That's a vernal pool. That's another hotspot that I'll be referring to in the course of this talk. Come down at a sort of and 7 o'clock angle from Mark's Pond, and you can see the Beaver Pond, True Run Branch, and Otter Point. So those are the hotspots, as I call them, which really commanded a great number of observations and were entered into the book as the seasons progressed. Just to give you the context, Glenda described this as very close to Washington. You can see the Chesapeake Bay. If you look at the little brown spot, really just north of DC, that is the headwater of the Patuxent River. If you come down to that little spot into the Chesapeake Bay, that would be Solomon's Island. So that's the Patuxent River. And it's a sort of smaller version, if you like, of the Potomac to the southwest. Next slide. Right. This is a snapshot, an idealized one, obviously, of what's called a tidal wetland. It's one of the unique habitats in Maryland. And we really go from an open water system to the right, with the bird life in particular taking advantage of fish and other wildlife there. We move then into what's called the low marsh, the spatterdock, pickleweed, etc. Moving then as the water shallows to what's called the low marsh. And here you see the rice, the cattails growing, and various other plants that typify a marsh at this juncture, if you like, of the continent, the mid-Atlantic. And then I'll be describing a little bit of the woodland, since that's obviously a part of an ecotone, as we segue into the upland area, what's called upland forest in Maryland terms. Now, a few months ago, if you were to take the observation deck and look over the marsh, this is what you would have seen in winter. A bleak prospect. The marsh vegetation has gone. It's really a slurry. There's a lot of decay. There's a lot of microbial activity, even under low temperatures. And some life certainly would persist there. But what is interesting, if we go to the next slide, is just how much already is bursting, if you like, from the activities of a slight change as we move from the high point of winter to a point which would come in February. And look at this wonderful plant here, which was of significance to Native Americans because it did allow them to be used for various treatments, particularly easing childbirth. The problem was, as research has since concluded, it actually was toxic, so I'm not sure it really helped that much. But it's called partridge berry. It's an autumn fruit, and it's one that provides birds in particular, but mammals, with sustenance during the winter. It dies back a little bit to allow flowers to perpetuate, and you would see this a little bit later in the year. It was actually called Michella repens after a Virginian surgeon in the 18th century. And he described this and was entered into the catalogue with Linnaeus in his classification of plants and animals. Okay, that's surprising, but our next slide is really one of quite unique properties because it's capable of what's called thermogenesis. It's skunk cabbage, and it actually can poke up in the harsh winter conditions through the ice because of its ability to generate heat to something order of 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's the flower that you see. The leaves are supporting it, certainly. But in the flower, there's a fetid pollen area which attracts insects. And believe it or not, even in harsh conditions of winter, you would see insects pollinating, be attracted because it has sort of rotting meat smell. So it's again another play, if you like, on attracting means of pollination and generation for the next generations. Okay. Many of you will have seen this. I think it was a very popular plant. It's called club moss or running pine, and it does have runners through the leaves that you wouldn't see here. But if you scrape the leaves aside, you would certainly see them running across the floor. It was popular as a Christmas decoration, so popular indeed that it became rather rare. It was banned in the 90s in order for it to be sustained. It really makes excellent cover for the ground, and although perhaps it doesn't supply much in terms of food during the wintertime, it certainly provides some cover later on. Okay, thank you. Next slide. Now, I call this the Gang of Four because they coalesce during the wintertime. Here you see a golden-crowned kinlet, Carolina chickadee, tufted titmouse, and of course the nuthatch. Now they gang up for various reasons. To search for food, their niches are quite different: end of branches, trunk, etc., and other aspects of life on a tree. They gang up because obviously they're looking for food, but also for protection, and they can pass calls between themselves to warn that there is a danger ahead. Interesting enough, as they pass through territories that may be held, the one holding that territory hangs back, allowing the rest to circulate through the forest. An experiment, a very ingenious experiment, but a simple one, was conducted by Paul Ehrlich in the middle of winter in Ohio. he took his students and said, look, let's throw seed in this wood and not in another one. And what he found when he threw seed around and made them very seeding available, that they actually broke up their gangs. They dispersed. They were quite happy they gathered seed. So it was that compelling need to find food under these harsh conditions that obviously brings them together. Harsh conditions, certainly, but no longer for us in Maryland. This is quite a rarity as we found this winter. But even so, the book describes strategies that trees adopt to overcome these winter conditions, snow that you see here, the bending, for example, of branches, the flexibility, the tree bark itself. Believe it or not, trees actually heat up even in winter conditions, and they have transpiration and other mechanisms to cool down, but avoiding the tensions that would create, if you like, between the icy outside and the warmer inside. Okay, next slide, please. Now, if you were to walk in your area and certainly at Jug Bay, you would see these catkins. They're alder catkins, and you can see the female cones in the lower third from last year. The male and female organs are also displayed, the smaller ones being female, the larger ones, the male. And what is interesting is that they break down into pieces that the Native Americans used, again, to treat gallstones and try and rid them or break them down for ease of passage through the urethra, etc. Again, as I said, if you walk around the landscape now, you'll probably see these in a slight advance for their pollination. I don't know how many of you would be able to recognize this. This is spotted wintergreen. Bloodroot is maybe its alternative name, but you may also know it by, again, the Native American name of Pipsissewa. Again, this is a medical treatment that can be used was used by Native Americans for various purposes, but it's been found to be toxic. So I hope that it didn't cause too many problems for those using it during those times. You can see the flower, an elegant flower that'll come later on. Up to about this time, you'll only see the leaves in the forest floor, but later you can expect to see that rather elegant flower. Okay, no marks for this. You see them at Dyke's Marsh. They're around in the wintertime, very splendid animals. But now, of course, flown. You would only see them up to about February, March. Although this year, with a very cold March, they may have lingered. I don't know whether you experienced that this year, but in the past year, that's happened. But it's a wonderful sight to see these swans take off, and there are quite a number of them at Jug Bay. How many of you would recognize this? This is the mourning cloak butterfly. It's the Methuselah of the butterfly world. Why? Because it has a life of something like 14 months. It overwinters as an adult. So it means that it's the first out, and you would see it at this time of the year or earlier as an adult flittering around the forest floor. What is interesting is that it pupates actually in the autumn and then emerges as an adult just before winter to survive in nooks and crannies as an adult form. It's quite an exceptional being. Note the blue banding along the edge of the wing. It's called mourning cloak because mourning cloaks in Victorian times were very drab. And this suggests that someone may have actually tried to give it a little bit of passion, if you like, by adding a band of blue at the base of a coat. Here is another very interesting adaptation. You've seen it many, many times. It's the American beech, and it clings onto its leaves right up to the beginning of spring. It only falls when the buds push off the leaf. And there are many theories as to why this phenomenon, which is called marquescence, provides the tree with an edge on for the winter and other conditions. The belief is that the leaves fall and can actually manure the soil because the soil of under beech trees is usually rather thin and limey. The second hypothesis is that those leaves actually direct snow to the base of the tree, and therefore it can enjoy a less harsh winter. A very interesting phenomenon indeed. Okay, well, we've looked at winter. We've passed that now. Of course, we're looking at spring, but it's characterized by, as you know, dark, cold conditions. Hibernation and dormancy was its main character. Many animals hibernate, except, of course, for our butterfly. Stocks have been used that were set aside in the autumn for survival. But with the lengthening of the daylight and plants responding, there's an early start to some plants. Some plants, as you saw in terms of the club moss, the wintergreen and catkins, were already spurting away. And they were taking advantage of the fact that sunlight is available before the canopies germinate this incredible sort of cathedral of greenery above them. And of course, you've seen also suggestions of the migration of waterfowl, particularly the tundra, on the wintering ground, and already during the end of winter leaving. Okay, if we look at the next slide, we can see, next slide, please. Something.
Deborah, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I'm not sure I'm sorry. Colin, where should I stop?
Winter, if you go for the next slide after winter, that'll catch up. Yeah.
Okay. Back to this one. Okay.
Okay, so the next slide will show vernal pools. I mentioned that in terms of the geography of Jug Bay. These are very distinctive habitats. Or unlike the water columns that you would see around any marsh.
I'm sorry, I'm still seeing winter. Deborah, are we supposed to have a different slide?
Yeah, there we are. We got it. Okay.
Thank you.
Phenomenal eco habitats, because unlike, as I say, open water pools, etc., that are deep and have more of a life to them, these are dependent on decay. So sunlight can only take them to a certain level. It's the leaves that result from the fallback in the autumn that actually are the energetics, if you like, to these vernal pools. So it's quite distinct from the norm of water bodies. I will see in the next slide, perhaps better exemplified, because what I was saying is that in your normal cycle, you see the producers, the herbivores going through the usual chain. In the case of the vernal pools, you can see the decay. It's the end point, if you like, that drives the microorganisms that feed in turn on them and to produce they're no carnivores here. They're in the sense that they're not the top dogs that you would find of birds, herons, and things like turtles. They're very low level, if you like, and so the energetics is much reduced, and so are the pressures on life cycles. Next slide. But in them, at this time of the year, they're just beginning to generate. You probably hear peepers around. Certainly we have them on our little pond, the back garden. You'd also, if you went there, you'd hear them now, of course, you'd be able to muddy your hands in the water and find these fingernail clams. You would probably find fairy shrimps if you looked hard enough in the bottom left. You would certainly hear the wood frog, perhaps a little bit later than the peepers. So these creatures survive there because they're not predated. There are no fish, very few mammals that would venture into those little pools. And so, as I said, it's quite an exceptional habitat and only found in various locations up and down the East Coast. What is found there too are these salamanders, spotted salamander. And this is one that lays its eggs in the pool during the rainy nights. It migrates from the forest floor into the pool during the rainy nights, lays its eggs, doesn't hang around, and the hatch, the eggs that are laid, you can see the larvae there, hatch at 2 months' time, and they too leave when they're fully mature, joining their parents in the undergrowth. Okay, next slide, please. Well, we've seen earlier our friends, the skunk cabbage, and you can see how much it's grown. I was there, that is at Jug Bay just last week, and the upper slide actually is what I saw as growth. You can see they're massive already, and the interesting thing is the taproot is much longer than what you see above them. And later on, I won't show this slide again, in the fullness of time, you'll see those wonderful leaves, which actually can provide food. The tips, for example, are taken by yellowthroats, and indeed they're found, on occasion, they found nests of yellowthroats in some of these. Okay, next slide. Well, with the rush of spring, climbing temperatures, come fish. They come up the Patuxent River, and they're readily available, of course, for the great blue heron. You can see the yellow perch below. It's a movement that's beginning to swell, and I'm sure when the resurgence, if you like, of wildlife, what's available, becomes all too present as the spring progresses. And of course, now we were just talking before began the talk, but the occurrence of ospreys. It's been on our creek for 2 weeks in southern Maryland and portions of Virginia. You probably would have seen them earlier, but they too are able to take advantage of the rush of fish and begin their courtship. And you can see the sort of elegance of the perch that they have to catch fish, and then the ones when they court, they always face the head. So it's an aerodynamic property. They're able to take advantage of the fact that it's an ease of passage when they direct them that way. If, again, we were now in April to walk along the base, if you like, of the cliff of Jug Bay in the marshy area, we would see something like this. Some greenery, certainly. You can see the mountain laurel to the right. But what is interesting is if you turn to the far left, you can see a sort of area there, muddiness. And if we look at the next slide, we can already see the beginnings of spatterdock emerging from the mud. And what you have here, as well as spatterdock, in what's essentially the North Marsh, are cattails in the bottom right. You can also see spatterdock, which is the bottom left, and arum. I'm sure as marshland people enjoying that particular habitat, you're only too familiar, but this is what that sprouting will eventually give rise to. And what is interesting is that though they are different plants, have different reproductive bodies, as you see there in the flowers, they have these extraordinarily similar leaves. And why is the question? And the hypotheses are that because they're on a petiole, a rather lengthy one, they're vulnerable to the vicissitudes, if you like, of the water rushing past them in flood or the wind. And this projection, if you like, this shape is supposed to tolerate that movement and allow them not to endanger their petioles. Well, again, no marks for this particular bird, a wonderful creature, Carolina wren, Carolina duck, or excuse me, the excuse me, I got leaf my throat, wood duck. It's looking obviously for habitat, and here a nest box. It can actually lay up to something like 10 to 15 eggs. There have been occasions when no less than 29 have been found, and that's been an egg dump, where another female, not being able to find a nest, has just taken advantage of another female. And believe it or not, that 29 actually had a 35% success rate. So she was able to rear a good chunk of those eggs that were nefariously deposited in her presence. Well, again, you've already seen this. This is spring advanced, the redbud. Why is it that it adopts this strategy? Well, it takes advantage already of bees and insects that would not be available and not have a habitat otherwise than these wonderful flowers. So I just show this again as the promise of spring and what we're beginning to see as a movement of temperature and lighting conditions begins to transform our habitats. Okay, next slide. Well, we arrive at what's been called green cathedrals. We look through here and we can see the spatterdock now having emerged from the foremarsh. In the distance, there are the cattails and the phragmites. But you can see already the shading. Those plants that were early emergence are now clouded, and they have different strategies to hope that they can find sufficient light to allow photosynthetic activity. But again, we're in the sort of fullness of spring, and what we can expect, as we see in the next slide, of course, are migrants. Birds start to come in. We're talking about the end of April and early May or mid-May, depending on the climate. And you can see here an operation that's conducted regularly at Jug Bay. It's called the Monitoring Avian Productivity and Survivorship Program, MAPS, which began in California in 1989, and actually was established at Jug Bay in that year. It's one of the longest running of the programs, and it captures warblers, rings them, bands them, and then sends them on their way. Believe it or not, there's something like 120 breeding birds in Jug Bay of something like 280 species. So it's a phenomenal place because of its varying habitat from marsh to woodland and grassland. It holds an enormous number of fauna and flora. The next slide actually will show you a very interesting bird. This is a red-eyed vireo that's quite magnificent, but not a magnificent song, I'm afraid. It sings all day long and it's highly monotonous. It's become known as the preacher bird, perhaps very appropriately. But this one actually was ringed or banded for something like 11 years. I don't know that it's any longer the case, but it was a record again set at Jug Bay. The warblers that the migrants I was referring to, of course, are the ones that you'll see very shortly. We look here at the American redstart, the Parula warbler, the magnificent prothonotary warbler, and of course the ovenbird. And these are regular visitors to Jug Bay. Some of them actually nest there. The prothonotary warbler and the ovenbird certainly do. I've seen their nests quite often. But not to forget the water. And here we see a northern snake. We're in perhaps May, June now, and we're seeing them bask on these logs, capturing the water so they can gain energy enough to chase their prey. And that basically will take us then to a summary of the spring. Let's look at the highlights that I've tried to engender in the presentation of the spring. If we look at the next slide, we can see that it's been a case of, excuse me, I'm going to move this, a case of winter visitors leaving. I talked about the resurgent vegetation and growth from base to treetop, blossoms appearing and attracting pollinators, migrants now able to feast on the resurgence of protein derived from insects and other sources. And of course, when they arrive, they start to establish their territories and song fills the air. We expect that at the end of May and for all of June as we enter summer. In the next slide. Now that shot, remember I began with showing you the dark, dreary conditions of winter. This is now a swamp oak that's in full bloom. And you can see the marsh that's been hidden by an incoming tide, and then what's revealed when the tide recedes. Next slide, please. You can also, if you move around the marsh, I'm sure you've seen this at Dyke Marsh, see these wonderful northern red-bellied turtles lining up again for heating purposes before they dive in search of their prey in the water column. Okay, but what's interesting now are these two creatures, which I'll show you next two slides, beginning with this one. This, as you probably know, is a water strider. It has an ability, because of hydrophuse hairs on its legs, to take advantage of the water tension and move around willy-nilly. Here in coitus, obviously double weight, but it still manages to provide enough coverage of the water surface to prop itself up. And the next slide will actually show you something, if you want to go into it, the mathematics behind this design. It's rather intriguing. I do take up this as a discussion in the book. These hydrophuse hairs on just one leg. So you can see what imprint that might have on the surface tension, enough to keep the animal above. But equally interesting is the next slide, which shows an aqualung in process. This is our old friend, the water boatman, using an aqualung. It's the elytra, the wing covers, if you like, are able to hold what would be the equivalent of oxygen tanks in its body, enough for that to diffuse, to keep it oxygenated while it grapples for any activity underwater. It will rise periodically to the surface because over time, nitrogen actually begins to replace oxygen. So there's need to retain the level of oxygen for, again, its movements below the waterline. Well, what is further interesting is the fact that nymphs in the form of these dragonfly or damselflies, actually, because they're exceptional because they don't go through the normal egg pupa stage, egg, nymph, pupa. They go straight from egg to nymph. And you'll see these certainly if you throw a net into the edge of a pond. I'm sure you'd come up with these creatures. They then move up as in this nymphal stage to the stalks above waterline and then hatch the following creatures, which you'll see in the next slide. And here we have a very interesting collection of both damselflies and dragonflies. The dragonflies are the whitetail that you'll see in the top left-hand corner, this ebony jewel-wing damselfly, and below it, the forktail. I'm sure you've seen that. That's a creature that's very common around marshes. And then lastly, the citrine forktail is the one on the left-hand side. The blue dasher is the one on the right-hand side. These are aerobatic beyond, and they snap insects from the air. I mean, I don't have to tell you just how wonderful a sight it is to see these buzzing around and in search of their prey. Next slide. Equally, at this time of the year, in terms of the insect coverage, we would expect to see this wonderful assemblage here. And they are, because there's so many pollinator gardens at Jug Bay, they are fairly common. You'd find the clouded sulfur, left-hand top, the buckeye. I'm sure many of you have seen that. And of course, the swallowtails in the other column. But what is interesting here is that actually this is a moth that I've included. And it's the moth that feeds on the tree of heaven. That's its habitat. And it's daylight. So it works its methods, if you like, for seeking pollination during the daylight hours. It's quite an exception for the moth kingdom. Although I say exception, there are in fact a number of moths that actually diverge from being just night crawlers, if you like, or night inhabitants. Okay, the next slide is now coming to our ospreys, which have really got well underway by May, June. They're beginning to feed their young. And the next slide will show just how wonderful these creatures are. I don't know if you've ever been at an osprey's nest, but you can, if you go to Jug Bay, you can arrange a boat ride to these sites, these nesting boxes, and see these sites. I've actually held them in my hand as they've been banded. And they're really tame, wonderful creatures to observe. People don't like them because they make a mess of their docks, etc. But I must say, I find them quite an exceptional sight. Next slide, please. No marks for this again. It's our old friend, the Marsh wren. Actually does breed at Jug Bay, although not very frequently. Interesting about this is it can make up to 20 nests. Now, wrens have normally been known to make 5 or 6. I've got some around our house making 4 or 5 nests. Not unusual, but 20 nests, and in these conditions too. This does need, again, bode an extraordinary sight for anyone coming across them as they wade through the stalks of the cattails. What is another fascinating aspect of these cattails, however, is in the next slide, which shows the sac spider. This is a spider that's got the ability to actually turn a leaf and create, a cave-like structure within that where it lays its eggs. And it's a silk nursery in effect, and you can see the eggs are slight yellowing above the actual spider. And of course, as in most of history, it's the female that tends these eggs. The male has long scooted off. Next slide, please. Well, this is the iconic shot for me of Jug Bay in its fullness. We've now come to the fullness of summer, and you can see just at Beaver Pond what it might look like if you were to walk there at that time of the year and see all this greenery, the fulmination, if you like, of activities generated by light and heat. Next slide. Well, again, if we were to move on to the marsh, we would see the halter leaf marshmallow, the spatterdock, moving from left to right. You see these wonderful purple flowers of the pickleweed, and of course the stalks of the cattail, the thin leaf cattail. There's a thick leaf cattail. I think the only thin leaf cattail for botanists among you is found at Jug Bay, offering enormous opportunities for insect life, in turn feeding up the chained birds and others. What is interesting, if you actually were to pair that stalk of the cattail, you would find insects in there, and quite a number of them using that, and they sometimes overwinter in that form to protect themselves from the vagaries of winter. Next slide, please. Okay, well, of an evening, many of you would know this in your gardens and elsewhere, it's a time of fireflies. And I say that because they're more than just flashing light. There are occasions when a female below will flash a light that will deceive a male of a different species. He'll come down and she will gobble him, feasting, and of course feed her eggs eventually after she's mated. And you can see the caption of the firefly one I caught and photographed in the bottom left-hand corner. Okay, next slide. Well, just to sum up again, as I do for each quarter, it's been the high point of nature. We've seen the temperature really providing a sort of furnace for growth and luxuriance. We've seen longer days, so there's more life that can be led, if you like, in terms of feeding, particularly for birds. They'll go for something like 14, 15-hour days. Young will become preponderant, but it's a time also when summer ends, summer's all too short a lease of life, when seeds have to be prepared so they survive through the winter. Okay, next slide, please. And if you walk on that observation deck to look over the North Marsh, you would see the beginnings in autumn of the dieback of the spatterdock. But you'd also see, if you can look to the left, the beginnings of wild rice, resurgent wild rice, and a little bit beyond. But in the next slide, what is interesting is it's the time for the Burr marigold. This is a species that you see just beyond the dying back of the spatterdock, which flowers in the autumn times, end of August and September, and gives a glorious glow to that vista from the observation deck. Next slide. Well, why did I mention the wild rice? Well, it's interesting because it is the habitat of an interesting species, which we'll come to in a moment, but it's subject to a lot of predation by these mice, the marsh rice rat. And you can see many of them, they dash around in the undergrowth. Such has been their presence that there's a program to cover these stalks of the rice so they can't be eaten by the rats and collected for seeding. But what is perhaps well, yes, next slide, I'm sorry. What is staggering to me is to take hold of this soarer rail, which is dependent on the wild rice, and that's why it's so important to generate these areas. If you were to take it in your hands and squeeze it, it's like a concertina. It allows the soarer rail to creep through the wild rice. It's an incredible sight. I used to observe it sometimes when they come through on migration, to see them just how quickly they can run through the stalks of wild rice. Another aspect of the wild rice, which we'll see in the next slide, is of course the fact that hunters used to enjoy shooting the soarer rail. And here you can see at the time of slavery, being up all night to allow their masters to take advantage of their labor, and they would flush up these soarer rails, and of course they would be shot. The next slide actually shows you why it is, again, that these wild rice stalks have to be protected, because the Canada geese love them. They gobble them up, and you can see in the middle slide what happens when you have an unprotected area and a protected area. And there's been a big program, as I say, in Jug Bay to make sure that these wild rice stands survive through the agencies that you saw being seeds being collected, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, next slide. Wonder how many of you've seen these. I came across them on Greenbrier. They are turbulent Phosophila moth caterpillars, and they have double heads. Actually, you can distinguish them because the head actually are in the upper part of the slide, the middle section of the slide. If you were to perturb that Greenbrier bush, they would vibrate massively and scare anything. They certainly scared some people when I did this in their presence. And that's why, of course, it's called turbulent, a turbulent moth caterpillar. Okay. Again, going back to the water column, you've seen these fishing spiders. They stay at the end of the edge of the pools or water bodies, plunging their forelimbs in the water, and are able to detect minute changes. They can distinguish between a falling leaf and an insect. And out they go, sometimes below water, sometimes above water, to grab hold of their prey. Incidentally, because I mentioned earlier the hydrofuge properties of the water boatman, etc., the water strider, this also has similar capacity. If it was to go below water, it would bob up because of the buoyancy that afforded by these hairs. Well, this is always a delight, although we know only too well it's very much under pressure, the monarch butterflies, and these come through Jug Bay about the end of August, September, and we see them feeding on milkweed, or sometimes occasionally flowers, as what you see there. I just throw it in because it's an exceptional shot, and I thought you might like it, just to be reminded of those times when you just sit back and enjoy the spectacle. Next slide, please. Well, nature's been busy. It's produced fruit. Here you see the American black elderberry and winterberry holly. This is a time when the bird life in particular, in its migration, can stop over these places of sustenance, such as you see here. They can gobble these up and provide energy enough to continue on their journey. Warblers do migrate vast distances at night, but they can only do that for a certain length of time, and they do have these stopovers to allow themselves to regenerate their energy needs. Well, we'll see this all too soon. We'll see the red, we'll see the oranges, the yellows. Why red? Well, it's supposed that the pigment there, astaxanthin or anthocyanins, actually produce a substance that's toxic, and it prevents leaf miners and other predators on their leaves, if you like, from having too much of an appetite, and allows the nutrients to be withdrawn from the leaf over a longer period of time. I mentioned seeds, a time of seeds being prepared, and here I show the various aspects of seed dispersal. Some of these you'll be familiar with: wind, expulsion, animals, of course, and water. Different strategies. In the case of expulsion, they can go up to 30 feet from the plant stem. And in the case of an African plant, it's something like 200 feet, an enormous distance. Not surprisingly, it's in desert conditions, so it needs to shoot out and have as wide a surface area available as possible. Well, cast of characters here, again, the gang of three. Here you see, these are quite commonly seen, actually, Jug Bay, if you were to come. And at this time of the year, they're just beginning to show themselves after hibernating during the winter. You see the otter, the beaver, and the muskrat. And of course, the beaver has been very busy constructing its dam, which you'll see in a moment in a later slide. But an activity which certainly destroys some habitat, but creates others. And there's an argument, of course, about the relocation and repopulation of beavers to help, if you like, mitigate climate change. One of the adaptive features that has been adopted, particularly in the New England area. Box turtles, this is an eastern box turtle, you would think would not move around very much, but studies at Jug Bay have found it's up to a mile that they can move. And of course, they'll lay eggs in the autumn and then they'll seek shelter. They'll move into a cranny or well hidden amongst the leaves and live out the winter. Another strategy, of course, is storage. And you'll see here the eastern chipmunk already beginning to gather leaves, and of course our famous squirrel. Squirrels can support something like 70 seeds in their pouches. And what is interesting is that they can store something like 5,000 to 6,000 around their areas of where they choose to spend the winter. There's a feature here which I'd like to elaborate on, and that is that there is a belief that some trees have migrated at greater speed than would be expected with the retreat of glaciers. And I think one of the agents of that has been the squirrel, moving seeds further north than would be the case with changing climate. The jay also is thought to be a vehicle, if you like, for that expansion of forests further north in terms of at least the oak trees. I've not mentioned grassland, partly because there's not much meadow at Jug Bay, but what there is quite exceptional, and it has allowed me on occasion to go there at night and look at the insect life that comes up from the grass and bats that move around to gobble up the insects, and the strategies that insects, moths in particular, adopting in terms of an arms race to interfere with the echolocation of the bat. It's an interesting feature, and it's something actually it's in my next book that will be coming out, I hope, in the autumn on a night walk, 2 night walks that I did at Jug Bay. Okay, next slide. Well, our vernal pool looks in pretty sad shape. This is what it might look like in November, December. It's fallen back, it's dormant basically. The eggs, etc., and other means of hibernation have now been established. And we can expect that only perhaps a marble salamander will have migrated to the pool and have laid its eggs, enough to for hatching to have occurred perhaps later in the next spring. The decision is a delicate one for them because they have to know what the tide line, if you like, will be of that pool. Will it recede? Will it expand? It's a judgment that they're canny enough to make and able to survive. Our next slide is really one that's summarizing, yes, next slide, is summarizing what we've seen under autumn. We've seen the need for seeding, a means to allow the next generation to have a hold the coming spring. Breeding has obviously ceased. There's no breeding now. All the plants and animals are preparing in some form or other for winter. We've also seen migrants passing through, and they're provisioning on the fruits that have been developed by various plants for their migration south. Residents too are active. Some will move south, perhaps they're local movements, but they'll certainly molt and they will disperse. There's no reason to keep their territories, so they will actually move around, and depending on the weather, they might come back and forth. Again, the vagaries will determine their movements. And of course, winter visitors, they will come in, and we'll see those in the next slides. Next slide, please. Well, I caught this one evening at Jug Bay. I was just about to leave, and this wonderful spectacle, murmuration, starlings, just moving in these endless forms. And various theories have been propounded as to how they make this magical synchrony of movement. Again, the book elaborates a little bit on that, and I hope you'll enjoy reading what's supposed. String theory and other forms of theory now are being proposed to explain this magnificent ability to turn what seems in nanoseconds. Okay, next slide. All right, you know this bird, the brown creeper. But it's a puzzle as to why is that breast white? Shouldn't it be dark, particularly the fact that it could be dirtied by the tree trunks? Well, interestingly enough, it has a purpose, as all nature does, of course. The light falling on that breast is reflected onto the bark and can actually enable a better detection of insects than would otherwise be the case. Okay, next slide. I mentioned earlier this capacity of plants to jettison their seeds, and you see that here with the witch hazel. It's called a snapping hazel because of this ability, and it can actually throw its seeds something like 30 feet from the parent stock. But another interesting feature is the fact that it has flowers in November and December, as you see there, and they can survive frost. And it's actually the frost that pops these capsules enough for them to throw their seeds as this extraordinary distance. Well, you've seen this. I don't know if you've ever been able to catch a photograph like this. It's quite splendid. It's, of course, the Cooper's hawk. And because of the openness now of the trees, there's no overstory. It has an easier time to gather prey. They're very much on the alert to avoid being predated by an animal such as this wonderful creature. Okay, next slide. Well, I want to spend a little while on this spotted, excuse me, this North American spotted turtle. I always mix it up. This is a turtle that actually spends a great deal of winter in the mud, up to 4 or 5 months. It has the ability to oxygenate into itself by sufficient amounts crossing its skin, but also it hibernates to a level where the heart is actually hardly beating. And they spend their time in the mud. I actually on one occasion was netting something and I came across this, much to my surprise. I had to quickly put it back because I didn't want it to defrost and be fooled that indeed spring was apparent. Such another remarkable adaptation, which you'll find, I'm sure, in portions of Dyke's Marsh. Next slide, please. Well, here we have the beaver. This is its lodge. The winter has come. It's stacked food. It's now got sufficient storage to allow it to survive during winter. Sometimes it'll venture under the ice and pop up around a tree that's perhaps got sufficient push or pull with the wind to avoid freezing over completely. But another remarkable adaptation to winter conditions. Okay. In the marsh itself, as we saw in the first slide, there's been dieback, but quite a lot of nutrition is available. The organic matter has still got a lot to offer, and we'll see in the next slide. It's the case of ducks being able to use this very sensitive tip organ to find perhaps some fauna, certainly flora enough to ingest, and therefore filter out as these beaks do for its ingestion. Next slide. Well, Jug Bay, and I'm sure this is true of Dyke's Marsh, is subject to sea level rise. And so what we're seeing in the wintertime of waders, and ducks is under pressure because sea level rise essentially covers these areas that would normally be exposed at low tide, allowing these animals to take advantage of mud and seek worms and other creatures for their sustenance. And you can, I just show you here this decline of the shorebirds, but also, as you see there, water birds. I mean, they're just holding their own. So big plus here, but shorebirds, of which I include the waders, are really very much under pressure, along with some other birds. So what I'm saying is that Jug Bay, the sea level rise, is going to lose that emptiness, if you like, of the marsh at low tide, but also, of course, creeping up into the marsh and therefore pushing all these levels, if you like, from the low marsh, the high marsh, up to the point where, because there's a cliff, there'll be nowhere for this marshland to grow. And that's a very sad feature of a portion of Jug Bay. I don't know whether that's going to be very much the case with Jug Bay, but it's certainly something that all wetlands are now facing as climate change is increasing. Next slide. Well, the observation blind, which overlooked the South Marsh, in the wintertime would look very much like this. Nothing really apparent. A surface slurry, a movement of the water column back and forth. Minimum of life, if you like, that will be apparent, although a lot of microbial activities, I've said earlier, a dieback of plants and a general movement of any birds to the open water, where they were able perhaps to glean more in the form of fish and other animals. And you compare that with the height of summer, rather dreary, summery side of Flade, where cattails and spatterdock were all too in evidence. Next slide. Well, all is not lost in the plant world for these icy wintry conditions. Some of you may be familiar with the common mullein, and this is the rosette. It actually can survive winter, and it's got a taproot, rather like a carrot that's quite deep. But the cells within the leaves that you see there can actually freeze and survive. So it's one of the earlier signs of spring, or if you like, the ability of plants to survive in this form during the winter time. Next slide. And if you were to have been at Jug Bay and probably at Dykes Marsh, come sort of early morning, February, March, you would have seen this. The reminder that there's a constant cycle, that nature regenerates itself, and that spring is on the horizon, as we'll see in the last slide. If you were to go to Jug Bay in a few weeks' time, you would see this magnificent display of spatterdock, and in the distance, cattails and phragmites, and of course the green architecture of the leaves that give shade to the deck. So I hope you've got some idea of the quite exceptional nature of Jug Bay. And this is just a few of the highlights that I found when I walked there in the course of 1 year and took observations. There are many in the book that are elaborated and give you more detail. There's also an extensive reference system. If any of these points tickle your fancy, you can go to them at the back of the book and elaborate on a little bit of what I've told you. So I'll stop there, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Colin, for that fabulous presentation. I learned a great deal. We do have a number of questions, many in the chat, but I'm going to give preferential treatment to Glenda, who has her hand raised. Go ahead, Glenda.
Okay, thank you, Deborah. I can't do the video, but that's okay. I don't need to be seen. I'm going to exercise executive privilege here for a minute and ask you two parochial questions from our Dyke Marsh point of view. I know we have many interesting questions, and but I'll just ask you these two and then let other people. You mentioned, you called it the thin leaf cattail. In Dyke Marsh, we have what our Park Service biologists call the narrow leaf cattail, which is Typha angustifolia.
That would be the alternative name,
And
yes.
is that the same cattail?
It is, yes.
And
They're-
so in Dyke Marsh, our national parks, Dyke Marsh is part of the National Park Service. The biologists consider it to be a sort of signature plant, not a very, I'm sure I can't explain this accurately, but anyway, not a common type cattail. So that's one of our little claims to fame. Now, you also mentioned the marsh wren, and I believe you said that the marsh wren is breeding in Jug Bay. And we have had marsh wrens breeding in Dyke Marsh for eons, but we have not had any since 2016, which is very disturbing to us, and we're trying to figure out why. But you did say correctly, right, that you've documented marsh wrens breeding at Jug Bay. And any comments on why they may not be breeding in Dyke Marsh?
Well, I mean, I think climate change is in order there. I mean, they're under pressure anyway. Wrens are not the best survivors of winter. We've seen this in other wren species in Maryland. I don't know what explanation I can give you on that. I do know that it's been something of a rarity. I don't have the record for last year whether or not they bred or they found nests there. And of course, it'll be the case this summer too, when we look very hard to see if the wrens indeed are around. They seem to exhaust themselves by building all these nests. I mean, wrens do normally build 3 or 4, but the marsh wren goes overboard, building as many 20 nests. So I don't know whether energetics has a hold on them, if you like, but it's something that I can actually put to a wren specialist and email you, and you can pass on to members.
We'd love to have more information about that.
Yeah, I'll make a note of that.
Thank you.
We have a number of questions in the chat, and a lot of compliments to both your presentation and your spectacular photos. First question is, have you seen the spotted lanternfly in any of the area that you were surveying?
Only once. I must confess I cheated with that because that was done by a friend who I think did it in the Baltimore area. I was unable to photograph it at Jug Bay. We don't have many trees of heaven at Jug Bay, so it's not surprising that it would be some of your rarity. I don't know whether you'd find around Dyke's Marsh or in that area of Virginia, but if you do, that would be where you would find this Elianthus moth.
Okay. And our next question is, there are a lot of compliments, so I'm waiting through those.
Yeah.
No, it's good. Some people are saying they can't wait to read your book.
Oh, well, that's always good. Let them know that if they Google, they go onto Amazon, they get a very much reduced price. So if they want to buy the book, that's the cheapest way to do it.
Very good.
If I'm in the area of Dyke's Marsh, I'll be happy to sign them.
Oh, fantastic. That's great. We have many events. We'll have to invite you to some of them.
Oh, that'd be nice.
That would be lovely to have you. So if anybody else has any additional questions, if you'd like to raise your hand either through the raise hand feature or turning on your camera and raising your hand, or you can put them in chat.
Can I, in the meantime, offer people who might like to come to Jug Bay a walking group, if you like, you come in a group, I can happily do that any time of the year. I'll be happy to take you through the season as I saw it and the highlights that the book hopes to bring out as features of Jug Bay.
That is such a generous offer. Thank you. We will definitely have to get back in touch with you about taking you up on that. So thank you. There are a couple questions. We have one. I saw a hand raised and I think it's down now, but there's one in the chat about the otters. Are the otters breeding in Jug Bay?
Yes, they are. There was, unfortunately, an incident when there was so much water that pushed in the otter pond that the dam broke and it destroyed it sufficient to have the otters move into the marsh. And if you go to the observation blind, overlooking the South Marsh, you would see a new lodge. It's also occupied by some mink occasionally. So this has become a multivariate habitat, and indeed snakes and others. I mean, the structure of a lodge allows habitation by many other animals other than otters.
Trying to find someone had asked for the link to the book, and I'm trying to find that right now to put in the chat for anybody who's interested. I'll have that in just a second. Here we go.
I did say mink. I meant muskrat.
Oh,
Mink.
okay.
We don't have any mink. I'm always confusing them.
So there is a link in the chat now if you're interested in purchasing the book from Amazon. Can you describe again where Jug Bay is in relation to Dyke Marsh?
Okay, if you were to take the Beltway from Dyke Marsh and come up towards Baltimore, you would take the route to Upper Marlborough into Maryland. And when you reach Upper Marlborough, you would cross the Patuxent River, look out for that, and then you would see the turning to Jug Bay. I'll have to give you directions because I very rarely come that way. But it's quite an easy place to find.
This is Glinda. I would say it's 30 minutes or less from Dyke Marsh. It's, as a crow flies, it's probably 10, but but yeah, it's not very far.
That's right. You had to come, didn't you, to see us?
Yep.
So you know the route. It's not hard to find.
We have another question about the bald eagles. Someone has seen numerous bald eagles there, and wondering if they are nesting in that area.
They are in the South Marsh area. If you were to look downriver, you would see nests on the left-hand side. They are around throughout the winter, and the courtship during the winter months is a sight to see, of course, as they fall through the air, sometimes crashing on the ground. I don't know how many nests there are now, but up and down the Patuxent River, there must be something like 40 pairs.
Oh, wow.
The Patuxent River is quite long, of course, and further south, there are many nesting sites. They may not be on the river exactly, but they're certainly in association. At Jug Bay itself, I would suspect there are about 3 pairs. And we do see them all year round.
And I'm putting in the chat the link to Jug Bay's website for
Excellent.
anybody that wants more information about parking and everything else.
Let me also offer something which I mentioned, a book that's coming out of mine in the autumn, where I did an all-night walk at the height of summer during the summer solstice and the winter solstice. And what I do is, like the book that you see has been discussed this evening, I sort of bind my observations in time as I approach midnight and then beyond, take a rest and then come back in time for dawn. It's an exhilarating experience. It may seem very tiring, but it opened my eyes to a new world entirely. And it's the other half It's the one we're blind to, basically, and one in historic times we feared. But if people would like to do this again, I'm quite happy to walk. I suspect they want to do this more in summer than winter. I found it quite arduous to do it in the middle of December, I must confess.
Well, I know I'll
Okay.
put you up on that to look for and listen to bats. We'll have to talk about bats another time. Glenda, did you have a question?
No, but I think we're close to winding up here, aren't we? Yeah. So Deborah, do you think there are any more pending questions that we need to
It
pose?
doesn't look like it at this time.
Okay. Well, Colin, I'm going to ask you a sort of big picture question, and then we'll close it for the evening. You know, wetlands traditionally in this country were viewed as cesspools or dumping grounds, or
Yes.
you know, bogs full of mosquitoes and mysterious creatures. And could you just make a few comments on the value of wetlands and why we should care about them?
Yes, I mean, they're the obvious ones of protection from storm and the productivity they offer. I mean, they're good spawning grounds for fish. They're also quite productive in other ways for vegetation, if you choose to share that, as past civilizations did. For example, North American Indians did a great deal of scouring the marsh for its vegetation and used it as part of their diet. But there are other aspects too. I mean, in Florida, they're used very openly to clean water. Sewage is directed, perhaps primary treatment, sewage is directed into these marshes. And I've seen them, many of you perhaps have been to Florida, and they do an excellent job. By the time the water is filtered through, provided it's engineered properly, if I can use that term, the water really is clean and returned, recycled to the natural world. But you know, there are other features too. They stabilize riverbanks, as I've said. The sinusoidal nature, for example, of Jug Bay is largely guided by vegetation. If you remove that vegetation, you're going to have flooding problems. And that's one other feature that they offer. They're protective in so many ways. If we move into other wetland habitats such as mangrove, again, they provide enormous benefits to pollinators. And as a result, again, people in past times used them as sources of sustenance. But more particularly in the case of the mangrove, they do stabilize the soil beneath them. They protect the worst aspects of hurricanes that crash through them, reduce flooding. So one can go on with these benefits. And it's a sad thing that they've been seen as dumping grounds, as you suggest, wastelands to be thrown over with waste and treated, for example, as development properties. And many areas around the world have lost their migrants, waders, because they've been covered either directly or indirectly with development activities.
Well, thank you very much. And yeah, I think we're very lucky to have the few wetlands remaining, and we, the Friends of Dyke Marsh, are trying to save our Dyke Marsh and to restore it, which is a subject for another time. So
absolutely. Let me just add one thing, and that worry is climate change, because we're going to be up against it.
Yeah.
A sea level rise,
right.
Really biting very deeply. And I don't know whether you're familiar with Eastern Shore, but they're trying to elevate the level of the marsh there so that there's an ability to creep inland, if you like. And properties are, for example, a Blackwater Refuge around there, the basements are permanently flooded. There's no value to the housing. It's been that dramatic. And we're going to see that on the Eastern Shore in a very big way. And all we can hope is that these adaptive strategies will be done enough in time to have at least salvaged some of the wetland.
Well, yeah, I think that the impact of sea level rise is a topic for another another talk. And
Right.
the Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences, they've done a lot of projections of the impacts on Virginia's tidal wetlands. So
You're right.
yeah.
Mhm.
Anyway, well, thank you so much, Colin. It was a wonderful presentation. Thank you, Deborah, for engineering us and managing it. And thank you, everybody, for attending. And Colin, we'll follow up with you on a walk.
Yes, absolutely. I'd be very happy to do that. And we can arrange it at all seasons.
Okay, that'd be great.
Okay. Thank you very much
Okay,
for doing this. Bye-bye.
bye.